So, questions, please. Here's a lady. Please always say your name and introduce.
Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. My name is Seda Röder, and thank you for this illuminating lecture. It was really interesting on both sides. I would like to address a question about the free press and where you see the role of, speaking out loud. We have seen a couple of situations recently in Malta, for instance, where people from the press have been prosecuted by the so-called mafia. So how can we address all of these issues in a holistic way if nobody is allowed to speak out?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And in some respects, when we talk about transparency, the ultimate transparency is the free press. And there have been a number of cases where corruption reform would not have happened in the absence of a free press because it put tremendous pressure on the government. Indonesia is a good example of that. There was some movement of reform in Nigeria, not a great deal, but some, and it was a function of the fact that actually Nigeria does have a relatively free press, and there were a number of scandals about the loss of oil proceeds in Nigeria. So free press, I think, it can be an extraordinarily powerful anti-corruption. But of course, it is also undermining the free press is a source of political control, which gets back to fundamentally the question is, how do you address authoritarianism, which is a broader issue. But what I can tell you is that countries that have free press, it's much more powerful as an instrument, especially where you have an active civil society presence, where you have NGOs and whistleblowers that speak out on these issues. And there are countries that have embarked on effective anti-corruption precisely because they have those. So it's a critical issue.
Thank you.
I would like to raise the point that corruption is not only or not mainly a problem of capitalism, but in the non-free world. Mao Zedong started as a poor man. Putin is said to be a rich man. And in this house, Erich Honecker was poor at the end of his life, but he lived a life with a real, totally corrupt system. So outside the capitalism, where we don't have free press, yeah. But outside capitalism, corruption is sometimes even worse.
Yep.
Christoph Paulus.
I wouldn't disagree with that at all.
Christoph Paulus. Just probably a very stupid question, or two stupid questions. You mentioned tax evasion, and what is the context of tax evasion with capital flight? I'm thinking of Argentina, as you know better than everybody here in this room. One of the reasons of the crisis in 2001 was that something around $80 billion were sent out of Argentina. Is there a correlation which has also to do with the factor of corruption? Second question is, my own experience when I've been once working in Moldavia with insolvency judges, they were paid so lousily that even if there were a single person, this person in particular, he was married and had 3 kids, he couldn't survive with the salary. How does this correlate with the present day enormous amount of money which is pumped in the economy, in the financial world, and we have this low salary, which is the invitation or it's oppression to get bribed for the services which are offered?
Okay, so those are not stupid questions, Christoph. The first one on capital flight. The capital flight, at least in the context of Argentina, was primarily not the proceeds of corruption. It was simply residents and non-residents taking advantage of the fact that Argentina had an open capital account, and they took their money out because they saw that there was going to be a major depreciation of the currency. There could have been some corruption in there. It was a result of incompetence by the government, but I'm not so sure it was a result of corruption. The salary issue. The salary issue is, I agree with you, is critical. You know, one of the reforms that Singapore introduced was that when they gained independence, Lee Kuan Yew became a leader. Look, I mentioned him several times. I also have concerns. You mentioned the free press, for example. Singapore was not necessarily a place that had open and free press, but a couple of the things that he did to eliminate corruption are illuminating, and one of them was on salaries. So and I know a number of Singaporean officials. Singaporean officials are paid extremely well. In fact, they benchmark public official salaries based on what the market is, and they give them a bit of a premium. And when there were some complaints made about why are our civil servants making so much money, he turned to the critics and said, yes, our civil servants are going to be well paid, but relative to other civil servants in Asia, they won't be wealthy. Okay?
Okay, Herr Mayer. Und dann gehen wir mal nach hinten.
My name is Helmut Meyer. I want to thank you for those wonderful speeches. And my question is going to the basics you mentioned. Corinne, you talked about trust. Mr. Hagan, you talked about values. If I listen to the next generation, and I have 3 daughters, and I like the exchange of ideas, they don't trust institutions anymore. And if you read the book of Rachel Botsman, Whom Can We Trust, was just recently published. It's a question about, do we trust persons or do we trust in future technology? There is today more trust, for example, in the next generation in Uber than into a taxi license in Vienna with mysterious drivers and dirty taxis where you are supposed to enter the first taxi in row. If you call an Uber taxi, you have a wonderful clean car. Why is that? Because it's provided by a system which is rigorous because there is a feedback element in it. And the feedback element allows the customer to mention if the car is not in order, if the driver is not polite, if the driver is not following the rules. So my question is, if you really want to go into that subject, fighting corruption, haven't we also think about what new technology, artificial intelligence, Corinne, you had wonderful lectures on this, can do, and how we can use it? I was a bit shocked when I saw the answers to the 3 questions. Really shocked, because I thought there's 100% consensus that corruption is bad for society as well as for private business. I thought. And the last question shocked me, that only 15% are believing that the rule of law is the key. I mean, what else? So my question to both of you, can new technology and the values around this, with feedback to the customers, to the individual, create that change you are asking from the institutions today?
So, first of all, I think I mentioned that new technology is a very effective way of reducing human transactions. You are taking it one step forward, which is also the use of technology in creating accountability, right? Well, that is happening. There's a very interesting website that you can go to called IPaidAbribe.com. Yes. I paid a bribe, write it down, iPaidAbribe.com, and it's in India. And if you type onto it, people who have been asked to pay a bribe basically will provide their input, and it's then shown all over India, all over the world, as to how much they were asked and where it occurred. So it's publicized, and it creates a degree of accountability and transparency. So social media is being used in that respect. Your broader point about why it is that the youth don't trust institutions completely resonates with me. I have 3 children, and it exactly as you said, and I'm not quite sure exactly why that is, but I do believe social media can help.
Should we not mention blockchain in this context?
Sure. Yeah, blockchain is both a blessing and a curse. Because as you know, blockchain technology can drive some of the cryptocurrencies that can create anonymity, that can actually encourage corruption and money laundering. But blockchain can also create efficiency in transactions that cut out human interactions, and human interactions often can be the source of corruption. So I think blockchain has both its benefits and its drawbacks.
Okay. Question, we need to go to the back, please.
Yeah. My name is Emanuela Wilm. And what I was missing a little bit was actually the fact this, in my view, one of the sources of corruption is also the inefficiency of administration. Because the more efficient an administration as in the government as well as in the company is, the less you need to spend on corrupting things because things work anyway. So you don't have to put money into making it work. You don't have to bribe someone aside to make something work. And how do you see that? Shouldn't we really kind of make things much more efficient and reduce the amount of regulations so that they can actually get much clearer to the point in order to avoid corruption?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that one of an important anti-corruption strategy is deregulation, because many of those regulations exist precisely to allow for corruption. So I agree with that. But you need to understand that, I think it's like, my message is that there are all these points are true, but you can't place everything on that point. You have to look at it in a broader sense. For example, some people pay bribes to officials to do their jobs. You know? In other words, you're asking people to just do the job that you're refusing to do without a bribe, right? Because that's what happens. A customs official who will refuse to clear the goods when you have all the forms and they're waiting for a bribe. And that's a form of corruption. But there's another form of bribe where the bribe is for someone not to do their job, to turn away, not to look at whether or not the building in Bangladesh has the right materials. You see what I'm saying by that? So you need to understand that there are different types of bribes. In fact, in Russia, they actually have different words for these different types of bribes. I can't remember what they are, but there's bribes for asking people to do the things that they should be doing, bribes for asking people not to do what they should be doing. I mean, there's various categories. And you just need to realize that when you introduce reform, you have to introduce all of those. And sometimes it's not about asking people to be more efficient. You actually want them to be more vigilant. Not more efficient, more vigilant. To spend more time making sure that the building is built correctly, not less time. So it's not just efficiency.
First in the back, sorry.
Hello. Hi. My name
Can
is
you
Convoco.
say your name? Yeah.
Yes, I'm from Malawi. I am an MBA candidate here at the SMT. In your speech, sir, you mentioned something about corruption being a cultural issue, and that for you to tackle corruption, you really need to change the way people think and, approach the way they do work or business and all different kinds of things. There's an interesting colleague of mine. She's from Liberia. She's a fellow at Oxford. she has a program to teach kids about anti-corruption. So this goes through books, a bit of, I think, some movies a bit, like cartoons. And this is like building a new society from scratch. Because either she's lost faith in our generation, the older generation. How do you see this fitting in? Because I know corruption is something we need to deal with right now, but she's approaching it from a longer term perspective. How do you see that fitting into this whole picture?
I mentioned education at the professional level with the MBAs, but your colleague is on the right track. You should start when they're children. I was on a panel with Transparency International. It was actually, it was moderated by someone from Vice, and Vice, this broadcasting company, the streaming company, and they had some younger members of civil society who were talking about this very issue. And one of the women said, and I thought it was very powerful, that the problem with corruption when it becomes embedded in society is that it begins to affect social norms for kids at a very, very early age, because they observe their parents bribing people, and they internalize it as being just a normal course of action. So that by the time they're teenagers and adolescents, the idea of, when their father was stopped on the side of the road by a policeman, they've seen their father pay off the policeman and drive away. That becomes embedded in, that's acceptable. So you need to start reversing that at a very early age. So I completely agree.
Then very in the back, and then we come back to the front.
Hi, my name is Julie Morin. I have two questions for you. You mentioned the example of Georgia as being a place that has been very effective, and the example of firing a lot of the police officers and then raising the wages of the rest. Another thing that was interesting about the approach that Georgia took to that was they reorganized the application process for all administrative processes in Georgia, so that the person who takes your application for a passport or a business registration or whatever is not the same as the person who makes the decision about it. Yeah. And they actually shuffle they have a rotating schedule of people who are the decision makers. Maybe for 6 months they're working in the land registry, and then 6 months they're off into the the corporate and corporations registry, which makes it very difficult over the course of a process to actually engage in corruption. It's just not worthwhile anymore because of this administrative setup. I was wondering if you could give any other examples of other countries where things like this have been implemented effectively in other countries, and in addition to Georgia. And then second, you mentioned the point about corporate culture, and there were 2 points that were a little bit in tension with one another. One, on the one hand, you mentioned that CEOs that you speak with, pretty much universally say that corruption is bad for business and it hinders their work because they would like to have certainty. And on the other hand, we have these examples of the Panama Papers and of various different things like this. And I remember when I was living in Switzerland in 2008, 2009, there was a big investigation of 40,000 Americans who were committing tax evasion through Swiss bank accounts. And after all of that was said and done, the only person that ended up getting prosecuted was the whistleblower within the Swiss banks who brought this system to light. So there is a tension there as well in corporate culture. So I wonder if you could address that a little bit more about how, besides the suggestion for teaching executives meditation techniques that sort of teach them to bridge their personal life, we also need more accountability mechanisms somehow.
Yeah, well, so on your second point, I couldn't agree with you more that there needs to be greater accountability. And I have to tell you that, at least in my country, one of the reasons why there has been such a political backlash is because, in my view, many people feel that there was no accountability for what happened in the Great Financial Crisis. I was in Oxford, and Steve Bannon came to talk at the Oxford Union, and he started off on this point. There was the populist message about the lack of accountability for people who had brought the system down And basically, sometimes we're given bonuses for that.
But now you give the answer which was before missing when Helmut Meyer and you were saying, why do our children not trust anymore in the institutions? Yeah. And I'm sure we are dealing today with the consequences still what happened in the financial crisis.
Yep. I think so. I agree with you.
Because it shows only with a little bit retardation.
I mean,
immediately, you know?
And at the time when you're in the middle of the crisis and you're trying to stop the system from imploding, I can see why you have to bail out the banks. But then, once the crisis is abated, you don't just go back to business. You should find the people who are accountable. Do you see what I'm saying by that? So I think that we are dealing with the political fallout of an absence of accountability. Your first point, are there other cases? I'm really glad you raised this issue on Georgia, because my own experience is that these types of reforms, which seem really kind of technical, are really powerful. And I know that they're not as flashy as big scale prosecutions, but if you do it right, it makes a big difference. For example, there is a great way of thinking about corruption. Corruption exists when you have monopoly and discretion and no accountability. And therefore, if you accept that, like the police have a monopoly on enforcement, on investigation, whatever. So if you are able to reduce the monopoly power or reduce the discretion or increase the accountability, you can reduce corruption. So you've got these three levers you can push on, right? And in your example, you're reducing the monopoly because there are different people. We had one of the other reforms that we introduced in Indonesia that was actually quite effective, is that we used to have panels of judges. And we introduced a system of having ad hoc judges who would join the panel from the private sector, who were real professional lawyers who were not corrupt. And it made it much more difficult for the professional panels, the judges, to be corrupt. So your point is you need to also undermine the monopoly of discretion that people have. And you can do that with very specific administrative techniques that I think can be very powerful.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but then we come, please, then we come back in front. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Elisa Özweig. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. And a lot of issues have just been addressed. But I was wondering if you may speak a bit more as well to the trends in corruption, because you were citing as well the US as a positive example in the 19th century. But maybe today, you know, like we would say, oh, is corruption, you know, like on the rise again, you know, like also within Europe. And I was just wondering if there's also some insights on how essentially countries which have embraced or like went down a trajectory fighting corruption, you know, like what do they have to uphold or maintain in order to actually stay anti-corrupt, and what are essentially the bits and pieces in those societies, you know, like which we need to focus on most, you know, that essentially anti-corruption can be upheld.
Yeah. So it's a very scary proposition, right? And kind of Corinne mentioned this in her opening, which is that you have to be vigilant or else you go backwards, right? Well, that is so true. In fact, there is a political scientist who refers to this concept as what he calls repatrimonialism, which is the idea that in ancient societies, there was no distinction between the public and the private interest, because the ruler owned everything. His son or daughter was going to be king or queen. So there was no distinction between private and public. And over time, as economies have advanced, as we've had democracies, there is this clear understanding of the public interest versus the private interest. And that there is a risk that societies will go back down into repatrimonialism, that there is this confusion of the public and the private interest. And, you know, some would say we are seeing that in the leadership in the United States right now. My own sense is that notwithstanding what's going on in the United States, the institutions generally are responding relatively well. Both the press, the courts, and the civil service. But clearly, you know, what you're saying is a risk for any society, especially one where the institutions are not trusted.
Thank you very much. Harald Einsmann, Procter & Gamble. Number one, I'd like to thank you for the analysis of the problem, but also for suggesting at least some to improve it. That's a very good one. Small episode and then a provocative question. I was recently driving in a North African country, in an area where was the limit 50 kilometers per hour. I was driving about 12 kilometers per hour. I was stopped by a policeman and I was asked for a bribe, for a punishment of 25 euros. Now I had the choice with a fully armed policeman, with nobody who was his boss, no consulate and no ambassador to help me, so I paid. Should we suggest to our governments that some of the development money which goes out into those countries should be used, like in Singapore or like in Georgia, to get the poor policeman who was probably paid about 100 euros a month to be paid better and to be hopefully excluding these type of fines. And also, there's probably going to be a lot of money flowing out to invest in developing countries so that some of these migrant problems get sort of fought at the source so that they don't need to come anymore. Do you have any thoughts or any suggestions of how to get these flows of money better controlled and ready to arrive where they should arrive as opposed to in the pockets of the people who govern?
So there's two separate things there. The first one is this issue of development money to improve the administrative capacity of a state and increase salaries. As I've indicated, I think that's an important step. But like everything else I said, I want to emphasize one thing. You can't rely on that exclusively. Because, I'll be very frank you, no matter how much you pay a judge or a policeman, they're still going to be interacting with people who make much more than them. So there will still be a desire for them to make money through bribes, right? So you can't rely exclusively on wages. You also have to basically have vigorous performance management and dismissal. But this is when it comes back to values. You need to have a transformation whereby you have a civil service that is actually proud of being professional. If you look at those countries, I mean, Germany is a good example of a country that had a very good civil service over the centuries, a very meritocratic civil service. How do you develop that? It requires efforts at a number of different levels. It requires leadership. You know, in this North African country, what you would probably need is to have somebody come in who leads by example in the police force, who, you know, on those issues. So in terms of how do you stop the money going out into the wrong pockets, I think it's a huge problem. And the issue is that, again, many advanced countries receive this money and talk about how much they want to stop the flow of illicit funds, but they don't actually do that much about it. So the lack of enforcement is also a problem in many advanced economies. There was a Transparency International report on the Anti-Bribery Convention and the Financial Action Task Force, and they concluded that only a small handful of OECD countries actually enforce these laws. So so I think we have to call our own governments to account.
Okay. Professor Meinhardt.
Timo Meinhardt from Leipzig Credit School of Management, where we engage in values, and try to teach values. On the one hand, we experience that young adults, young students can't be taught values. Can't be taught. Can't be taught. Cannot be taught. Because people like Max Weber said, you can't teach values, you can people only invite to make values as attractive to people try to internalize. If this is true, that we as professors, as teachers at business schools can't simply impose values on others, we need to find more attractive ways to appeal young students. My question is a personal one. What are the intellectual resources you would like us to read with students which will stand the test of time, contain the practical wisdom we need? Is it rather reconsidering the Bible or any other religious texts you would like us to be taught at business schools, even if you can't really teach values? So what would you like us to do with students in terms of interesting intellectual resources?
May I just interrupt a second? Could you stand up when you ask your question? It's easier for the room to understand. Thanks.
So that's interesting. I mean, I would like to ask you what you think is the most effective. I was telling Corinne that I went to law school in the United States in the early 80s. And Watergate had happened in the mid-70s. And the Watergate scandal had a lot of reverberations, and one of the reverberations was the sense that lawyers had acted very unethically. So there was a big push in the law schools to teach ethics, and it became a mandatory part of the course. And I have to tell you, it was an important course for me. Not that, I mean, some moral compass, we all have a moral compass, and you know, you should know what right and wrong is, but as a professional, to sit down with your colleagues and a teacher and to talk about how ethical practices relates to the work that you do, to invite them to wrestle with ethical dilemmas, with scenarios that are not necessarily straightforward, I think is a good start. And I found it, and some of my other colleagues at law school found that to be very helpful. And I think that it makes sense to make ethics a required course in the curriculum. I don't know if it's required here. Is there an ethical course here?
Look, when I studied law, we had Studium Generale, and we were asked also to listen to philosophy and ethics and others. But today I hear it's no more. I think there is no more Studium Generale for lawyers, for law people, no? It's no more here, the expert says, no. So we have to reintroduce it after tonight. We learned something. Now there are two questions. Anna, you'd say, please.
Jeff Sullivan. You said we have to hold the government accountable, and you said nothing's going to happen unless the government effectively does it.
Here's the finance sector speaking. Sorry, Jeff.
But asking about politics to a guy in D.C. So if you... Closer? Okay. So if you have a situation like the States where you have two political parties that own the political process, and it's not in their best interest to invite a third or a fourth or a fifth political party into the process, and then once people do get elected, they would have to disenfranchise themselves to get rid of, say, campaign finance reform, get rid of lobbying, introduce term limits. How do you change that if they're the ones that are supposed to change it?
Yeah, I was worried that if I talked about campaign finance reform, that I would end up getting questions on this, because it's a really complicated issue, and there is I think there's a real central issue as to whether or not we're talking about corruption here. If you read, I don't know if any of you have read the Supreme Court opinion that basically took away the limit on the ability of the private sector to finance, not campaigns, because that's still limited, but finance expenditures on behalf of candidates, advertisements, etc. Well, there was a discussion in that opinion about whether or not this was corruption. And the Supreme Court said, even though corporations are people and have First Amendment rights, we don't want there to be corruption. And they said there's no corruption as long as there's no coordination between the candidates and the expenditures, which is why you have super PACs. If any of you know this expression, super PACs. So this idea that there's no quid pro quo. But the fundamental problem in American politics, in my view, is not necessarily that there's actual bribery. It's more that there are, in a country where nominally it's one vote per person, it's clear that money provides access and influence in the electoral process that makes an unequal playing field, right? And that the wealthy can amplify their views much more than the others who do not. And that amplification process creates an inequity. Do you call it corruption? You have to be careful here, because if you call it corruption, people will take issue with that because there's no bribery, et cetera. But fundamentally, I think there's a sense that whatever you call it, it's undermining people's confidence in the political system. Now, your question, how do you fix it? Well, we did have campaign finance reform in the past. We did do it. There were limits on both contributions to campaigns and on expenditures. The problem is the Supreme Court just struck them down. So we do have a problem, and I'm not quite sure how to fix it. So on this one, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Stefan Eilers.
Yeah, I have another US question for you. I thought the most efficient instrument against corruption was your Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US. And I was amazed that you did not mention it. Because if you take it from private practice last 10 years, the extraterritorial application of that act, copied by main jurisdictions, Europe, UK, everything, I think that really changed behavior and practices in the relationship. And I thought on my list that would be something which comes in your country, but a good tool. So,
it's a very good tool.
Yeah.
My issue, Stefan, my issue is that it's a very good tool, and the U.S. is to be congratulated for not only enacting it, but enforcing it. And the U.S. on these issues has taken action not only with respect to public sector corruption, but also in the private sector. For example, with the Olympic Committee, which was not governmental, right? So fraud. So the U.S. has been very active, but the problem is other OECD countries are not. A few, but if you look at, there's a study, you should read, Stefan, the Transparency International report on the OECD countries' enforcement of the Anti-Bribery Convention. It's not good. It's really not good. The US, Germany, and a couple of other countries have done a relatively good job, but many countries have not. And of course, there have been some celebrated cases, for example, in the UK, where the enforcement, the anti-bribery enforcement against payoffs to Saudi Arabia was shut down by the government because of their concerns about the impact that it would have with Saudi Arabia. So there have been, unfortunately, many OECD countries that have not been aggressive in enforcing the OECD convention.
But if you have unilateral application cross borders, therefore you might not need so much multilateral approach to things.
Right, but
Factually.
you do need the governments in those countries to do it. And my only point is that, and I think what we should perhaps one day do is get some of the OECD people to come. They themselves would say that only a minority of governments are enforcing it, and it's unfortunate. But the U.S. is to be congratulated for being perhaps the most aggressive. Just you and I spoke about this just beforehand. One of the most extraordinary scandals that is just breaking in the news right now involves Goldman Sachs, where 2 Goldman Sachs officials have been indicted for bribery and money laundering in connection with the sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia, 1MDB. Massive, massive bribery and conviction, okay? It was the U.S. that's bringing the claim. So the U.S. has been very aggressive in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And the reason why the U.S. wanted the OECD to do this is they wanted to multilateralize it, because U.S. businesses were complaining that if the U.S. was the only one doing it, the U.S. businesses would be at a competitive disadvantage. So.
Good. No more questions. I would like one thing, just to come back to technology and blockchain, because we have some blockchain experts in the floor. Hello. Bruce, Trent, do you want to add something to the technology? Yeah, Trent and then Bruce. We need a micro.
Hi, I'll stand up. Excellent talk. I guess my main question then would be, you had talked about the need to shift values, which lead to incentives manifested as economic institutions, which lead to corruption and the bad part. And I think throughout the whole evening, the assumption has been that it's all about people trying to get more money, and therefore, the main value is money. And I'm wondering if you got, you talked about blockchain to your great credit about the pros and cons of transparency in one hand and where you can hide it in the other hand. There is another amazing benefit of blockchain, and that is where you can use it as a means to implement incentives, to get people to do stuff. Bitcoin is a wonderful example where it actually got people to add security to the Bitcoin network by inflation within the network itself. And so I guess my question to you is, given that there's sort of other tools out there where maybe the overall incentive for the people doesn't, I guess 2 parts. A, does the overall incentive have to be money? Because that's sort of what's leading to corruption. Can it be maybe self-actualization or some sort of proxy for self-actualization, like feeding your family, getting education, all of that? That's the first part. And B, to what extent do you see tools to change the incentives around that? Blockchain could be one, but also, new theories of economics that do go back to things like reconciling the commons, Eleanor Ostrom style, or some of the new work by Glenn Weil, et cetera, where things like the cost structure. So, maybe Adam Smith was kind of wrong. Maybe, the young people of the world have a point. Money isn't the key, money isn't the answer. So those are my questions.
Yeah, I do believe that there are other incentives than money, and that that's why I don't believe that civil service wages are the only aspect. When I think, let me finish on this note. Whenever I think about what is it that makes, when people talk about strong institutions, what are they talking about? They're not talking about, they're talking about the existence of a practice that people consider to be worthy, a behavior that people consider to be worthy, that persists over time, even under changed circumstances in leadership, right? Like certain institution, and when I think about that, and I use my own institution, my former institution, the IMF, I actually think the IMF was a very good institution, because there was, and there still is, an incentive in the fund for the professionals to focus on the facts and to be independent and to try to resist political influence. And that was not being driven by money. It was being driven by a sense of pride. You know what I'm saying by that? That they saw a sense of self-worth by being independent. Now, how do you create, and I agree with you, it's an intangible. It's not about money, it's this sense of pride. But when you look at countries that have been successful, it's because they've been able to get a civil service that does that. And I'm not a sociologist or psychologist. I don't know how you do it, but I do know that it's more than money.
Bruce? No?
No,
okay.
no, I think that was a good ending point.
So thank you very, very much, Jean. Thank you.